Grant Caldwell walked into the chapel like it was a business meeting, his arm wrapped around a woman in a red coat, his mistress, and he led her straight to the front row meant for family. People turned. Whispers spread over the soft organ music. My swollen belly tightened under my black dress, and my fingers locked around Melissa's wedding ring on a ribbon in my pocket like it could keep me standing. Grant faced the casket and said, loud enough for both families to hear, "Let's not pretend she was a saint." A flash popped. Someone's phone screen lit up beside the aisle. One photo already saved, time-stamped, Grant's hand on the mistress's waist, inches from the casket flowers. I couldn't move. The funeral director had my elbow. His mother blocked the aisle. Even the pastor froze mid-prayer. Then Melissa's lawyer stood and opened a folder sealed in red, and the first page showed a bold line. Fraud with dates. And in the lobby, a security guard was already pulling up the camera footage because someone had requested it before Grant arrived. 3 weeks earlier, Melissa Carter was still on her feet. Barely. She clocked out of the ICU at 7:12 a.m., scrub top damp at the collar, hair twisted into a tired knot. At 41 and 7 months pregnant, she moved slower than she used to. One hand braced under her belly as if she could steady the future with her palm. Before she even started her car, she called her mom's dialysis center to confirm the afternoon ride. Then she checked her son's school app to make sure he'd turned in his math packet. Only after that did she look at the missed calls from Grant. Grant Caldwell liked things quiet, clean, controlled. And he didn't like extra questions. He didn't like her coworkers texting. He didn't like her sister dropping by. He said it was all for the baby, but Melissa had learned the pattern. When she had support, he had less power. At home, she slid a casserole into the oven for her mother. One of her self-sacrificing habits was cooking meals in disposable pans so her mom wouldn't have to wash dishes with aching hands. On the fridge, a family photo was held up by a magnet shaped like a tiny stethoscope. Melissa's smile in the picture looked like a promise she kept making, even when nobody noticed. Grant's voice came from the living room. "Where were you?" "Work," she said, calm. "Same place I always am." He didn't look up from his laptop. "We need to tighten spending, starting today." Melissa's stomach sank. "Yeah, mom's meds." "I said tighten." He held up the credit card like a leash. "You want security? You listen." She swallowed the fear and nodded because fear had a price. The mortgage, the prenatal visits, the dialysis copays. She couldn't afford pride. Not yet. Later, while Grant showered, Melissa went to his jacket to find the car keys. A small white receipt slid out and fluttered onto the floor. Hotel, 2 nights, a room number, and a printed timestamp from last week, when he'd told her he was working late with the partners. Her hand shook as she picked it up. She didn't confront him, not in the house, not with his mother due to arrive for Sunday dinner, not with her son in the next room, not with her own body already tired and vulnerable. Melissa tucked the receipt into an envelope labeled Baby Documents, then stared at her wedding ring until the gold blurred. And that morning, for the first time, she felt the baby go still. Right as Grant's phone lit up with a woman's name she didn't recognize. Melissa didn't leave because leaving wasn't just a door. It was 1,000 locks Grant had installed quietly one by one, while smiling like a good husband in public. Her mother, Ruth, lived in the downstairs guest room now. Dialysis 3 times a week. Oxygen concentrator humming at night. A plastic organizer on the counter filled with pill bottles Melissa refilled every Sunday. The copays alone were brutal, and the hospital billing portal on Melissa's phone never stopped updating. New balances, new past due alerts, new threats of collections. Melissa worked extra shifts until her ankles swelled, then hid the swelling under compression socks like it was a private shame. Her son, Noah, was 10 and still climbed into her bed when thunderstorms hit. He believed his baby sister would fix the family because Grant had said it at dinner with a laugh, like a joke that wasn't funny. Melissa kept Noah's world steady, packed lunches, clean uniforms, homework signed, because if she didn't, everything would slide. And then there was the baby. Her OB appointments were booked months out, and Grant insisted on driving her for safety, sitting in the waiting room with his arms crossed like a guard. If Melissa so much as asked a nurse a question without him, Grant would replay it later at home. "You're making me look bad," he'd say. "Do you want me to lose my job? Yeah, do you want us to lose the house?" He controlled the accounts. He controlled the passwords. He controlled the story. When Melissa tried to move a little money into her own checking account, the transfer bounced within minutes. A text came immediately from Grant. "Why are you hiding things?" Then another. "Don't make me do this the hard way." That was Grant's favorite threat. Vague enough to scare, specific enough to feel real. At church, people told Melissa how lucky she was. "Grant provides," the older women said. "A man like that is a blessing." Melissa smiled and nodded while thinking about the hotel receipt hidden in her baby documents envelope, thinking about the name that flashed on Grant's phone, Tessa, followed by a heart emoji. She wanted to scream. Instead, she made coffee, wiped counters, and folded tiny onesies with shaking hands, as if being useful could protect her. That night, Grant's mother came over and inspected the nursery like a judge. "Don't fill her head with nonsense," she warned Melissa softly in the hallway. "Grant has a future, don't ruin it." Melissa stood there with her palm on her belly, feeling the baby's hiccups return, and realized even his family would never choose her over him. She went upstairs and opened the envelope again. The hotel receipt. A second slip behind it. Something she hadn't noticed before. It was a bank notification printout. Grant's name, a new account, and one line that made her mouth go dry. "Beneficiary change request. Pending." Melissa heard Grant's footsteps outside the bedroom door, and she shoved the papers under the crib mattress, not knowing he'd already installed a tracking alert on every document she touched. The funeral home called itself a Hartwell Memorial. But everything inside looked more like a boutique hotel than a place for grief. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and expensive lilies. A crystal chandelier hung over a marble floor so glossy it reflected every black shoe that crossed it. A coffee station sat in the corner with neatly stacked cups, as if caffeine could make loss more manageable. The chapel doors were open, and the sound of a soft organ floated out in careful, measured notes. Up front, Melissa's casket rested beneath a spray of white roses and baby's breath. Flowers chosen to look innocent, pure, untouched. Beside it stood a framed maternity photo. Melissa in a pale sweater, hands cradling her belly, eyes tired but gentle. The picture was lit by a small spotlight that made her smile feel like a spotlighted lie. 2 rows were reserved for immediate family, marked with satin ribbons. Melissa's mother sat rigid, clutching a tissue in one hand and a hospital bill envelope in the other, the kind that never stops arriving even after the person is gone. Melissa's sister hovered near the aisle, watching the doors like she expected something terrible to walk in. Near the back, the funeral director spoke in whispers to staff in matching charcoal suits. A slim microphone on a stand waited at the lectern, polished and ready for speeches that would be judged by every ear in the room. Above the entrance, a security camera blinked a tiny green light, barely noticeable unless you were the kind of person trained to look for exits and risks. The crowd was a mix of church friends, hospital co-workers, and Grant's business circle. The business people didn't cry. They checked their phones. They murmured about schedules. A few nodded at each other with the same expression they wore at conferences. Sympathy practiced, eyes already moving on. And then there was the family section tension, sharp as wire. Melissa's side sat close together, shoulders turned inward, holding on. Grant's side spread out, taking space, acting like they owned the air. A closed folder with a red wax seal rested on the front table beside the guest book. The lawyer, Diane Holloway, sat in the first row with that folder on her lap, her hands calm, her gaze fixed forward like she was waiting for a cue. When the chapel doors opened again, people expected Grant to arrive late, smug and loud. Instead, he stepped in slow, hair neat, tie perfect, eyes wet like he'd practiced in a mirror. Then the woman beside him appeared, and the wet-eyed act didn't match the grip of his fingers around her hand. And in that same moment, Grant glanced up at the blinking camera light, then smiled like he already knew what it had captured. Grant Caldwell had always known how to look like the hero. At work, he was the steady provider. The man who spoke in clean sentences and shook hands like promises meant something. At church, he carried donation envelopes like props. At home, he kept his voice soft in front of other people, then turned cold the second the door shut. Melissa used to tell herself it was stress. Deadlines, pressure, the baby coming. But Grant's control wasn't new, it was just finally undeniable. He controlled the money first. One joint account, one credit card he managed. Every purchase labeled in an app on his phone. If Melissa bought prenatal vitamins, Grant asked why she needed the expensive ones. If she bought her mother an extra blanket, he called it waste. The day Ruth's dialysis clinic changed the copay, Grant didn't ask how to help. He asked how soon Melissa could pick up more shifts. Then he controlled the story. If Melissa looked exhausted, Grant joked in public. She's dramatic. Pregnancy makes her emotional. If she tried to talk privately, he'd tilt his head and say, "You're imagining things again." The more she doubted herself, the easier she was to steer. And now, at the funeral, he was controlling the stage. Grant entered the chapel with Tessa on his arm as if he were introducing a colleague, not flaunting betrayal. She looked too polished for grief. Sleek hair, perfect lashes, a red coat that belonged in a restaurant, not a morning row. Yet Grant didn't guide her to the back. He walked her to the front like a claim. Melissa's mother made a sound, half breath, half pain. Melissa's sister stood, but Grant's mother shot her a look that said, "Sit down and behave." Grant's co-workers watched with tight mouths, uncertain whether to be shocked or impressed. Grant leaned close to Tessa and murmured, smiling, "Remember, let them stare. They'll still do what I need." Money, status, promotion. That was always the real motive. Grant was up for partner at his firm, and a public image mattered more to him than a pregnant wife ever had. A clean narrative kept investors calm. A grieving widower got sympathy. A man moving on got pity. A man accused of cheating and financial games? That got audits. So he'd come prepared. In his inside jacket pocket, his phone was already open to an email draft labeled Estate Urgent. His thumb hovered near send. Across the aisle, he nodded at the funeral director like they had an agreement. Then he turned toward the front, eyes shining, voice ready for performance. "I'd like to say a few words," Grant announced, stepping toward the microphone. Diane Holloway didn't move. She simply watched him, as if counting down. Grant reached the lectern and placed his hand on it like he owned it. And as he cleared his throat to paint himself as the grieving husband, his other hand slid into his pocket. Gripping a document meant to force the room to accept his version of the truth. Tessa didn't cry. She didn't even pretend to. She slid into the front row beside Grant's mother like she belonged there, smoothing her red coat over her knees and crossing her legs with the calm of someone used to taking what she wanted. A few heads turned away in disgust. A few people stared like they were watching an accident they couldn't stop. Grant's mother leaned toward her and whispered, "Keep your chin up. Don't give them the satisfaction." Tessa's mouth curved. "I'm not the one in the box." Melissa's sister heard it. Her face went white, then red, then white again. She started to stand, but the funeral director stepped between the aisle and the family section, hands up in a practiced, gentle block. "Please," he murmured. "Let's keep the service respectful." Respectful! The word landed like a slap. Grant stayed at the microphone, performing grief with perfect pacing. "Melissa was complicated," he said, voice catching on cue. "But I tried. I truly tried." Tessa glanced at her phone, the screen reflecting in her eyes. A message preview popped up. "You did it. Everyone sees you." She tilted the phone so Grant could read it, then tucked it away like a secret prize. In the second row, one of Grant's colleagues, an older paralegal named Mark, shifted uncomfortably. He'd worked late nights with Melissa's case files when she'd tried to ask questions about their finances. He'd seen Grant's temper behind closed doors. Mark looked toward Diane Holloway, as if silently asking, "Are you going to let him do this?" Diane's hand stayed folded over the sealed red folder on her lap. She didn't glare. She didn't flinch. She simply watched the room the way a trial lawyer watches a jury, tracking faces, noting reactions, building a timeline. The pastor stepped forward to continue the prayer, but Grant raised a hand. "One more thing," he said. "Melissa would have wanted us to move forward. She wouldn't want drama." Drama. As if betrayal were a performance by the person who'd been hurt. Melissa's mother's tissue tore in half in her fist. Then Tessa leaned toward Grant and whispered, not quietly enough, "After this, we go straight to the bank. Don't forget the papers." Grant's jaw tightened for half a second, then relaxed. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the crowd. He wanted witnesses to his innocence, not witnesses to his plan. Diane finally stood. The room went still because when a lawyer stands at a funeral with a sealed folder, everyone knows something is about to change. And as Diane broke the red seal, Mark the paralegal quietly opened his own phone. Because he'd saved a copy of the email Grant sent the night Melissa died. Now Grant kept his hand on the lectern like he owned the chapel, like the casket behind him was just furniture in a room reserved for his image. He dabbed at his eyes with a folded tissue that never actually got wet. Melissa was emotional, he said, letting the word hang as a diagnosis. Pregnancy was hard on her. She made choices that pushed people away. A few of Grant's coworkers nodded politely, not sure what they were agreeing with. Melissa's nurse friends stiffened in their seats. They knew what emotional really meant in a man's mouth. Unstable, unreliable, not to be believed. Grant glanced down the front row at Tessa and smiled. Small, private, satisfied, then looked back at the crowd. "But I forgave her," he announced, voice firm now like a preacher. "Because that's what a husband does." Forgave her? For what? For being pregnant? Yeah, for needing help? For catching him? Melissa's mother made a low sound, a wounded gasp that didn't turn into words. Her fingers clutched the hospital bill envelope tighter until the paper creased. Her knuckles looked chalky under the chandelier light. Grant leaned closer to the microphone. "I know rumors are flying," he continued. "People love gossip. But Melissa wouldn't want her memory dragged through the mud." Then he did it, the cleanest cut, delivered with a calm smile. He pointed toward Melissa's family section as if offering compassion. "Let's be honest," he said out loud. "This is what happens when someone can't handle being a wife." The chapel shifted. A few heads snapped toward Melissa's sister. Someone whispered, "Did he just—" Another voice answered, "Oh my God." Tessa's lips pressed together like she was holding back laughter. And she reached into her purse and pulled out a compact mirror, checking her mascara as if the service were an inconvenient stop before dinner. The pastor took a step forward, unsure whether to interrupt. The funeral director hesitated, caught between propriety and the obvious disrespect. People stayed seated because social rules are chains. Stand up, and you become the scene. In the second row, Mark the paralegal stared at the floor, jaw working as if he were chewing on anger. Grant lifted the tissue again, theatrical. "I did everything I could," he said. "Now I need to move forward for the baby's sake." For the baby's sake. The words rang hollow in a room full of women who'd seen Melissa work double shifts with swollen feet. Grant stepped back from the mic, satisfied he'd stained her name without anyone stopping him, and he turned his body slightly toward Tessa, thinking the crowd couldn't hear. But the chapel was quiet enough to catch the truth. Melissa's sister heard Tessa whisper, "After the will, we go straight to the insurance office. Your signatures are already forged." Diane Holloway held up her hand before anyone could clap for Grant's performance. "This service isn't over," she said, voice level, courtroom calm. Grant's smile stayed pasted on. "Diane, not now." "Now," Diane replied. She stepped to the lectern, set the red-sealed folder beside the microphone, and looked straight at the funeral director. "Sir, please note the time, and please preserve all hallway and lobby security footage from today." The director blinked. "Ma'am?" "Every camera," Diane said. Her eyes flicked to the tiny green light above the chapel doors. "No deletions." A murmur ran through the crowd. Grant's jaw tightened. Tessa's fingers dug into her purse strap. Diane opened the folder slowly. Inside were pages Melissa had signed in blue ink. Dates neat, initials on every corner. Diane didn't read them yet. She let people see the paper first because paper is what makes liars sweat. Mark, the paralegal, felt his phone vibrate again. An email notification banner slid across the screen. REI Estate. Urgent. He didn't open it in front of Grant. He just took a screenshot of the timestamp and the sender line, Grant Caldwell, then angled the phone down, thumb hovering over forward. In the front row, Melissa's mother whispered, "What is this?" "A protection," Diane said softly without taking her eyes off Grant. "Melissa asked me to be here. She planned for this." Grant stepped forward, keeping his tone gentle for the room. "My wife was confused. She was under medication. Diane is taking advantage of grief." Diane didn't argue. She turned one page, then another, revealing a list of account numbers partially blacked out, like a promise of evidence without giving it away. Grant leaned closer, trying to read. Behind him, Tessa whispered, "Don't panic." But her voice shook. Diane raised her chin. "Before I read any will, I want one thing on record," she said. "If anyone here has messages, receipts, or recordings connected to Melissa's death and Mr. Caldwell's finances, you will send them to my office today." Mark's thumb tapped forward. Across the lobby, the security guard who'd been asked earlier to pull footage slid a USB drive into his pocket and watched Grant through the glass doors. And as the organ restarted, Mark sent Diane the email chain, while the guard saved the video clip under one word: fraud. Grant didn't wait for Diane to read a single word. The moment she asked for the security footage to be preserved, his face changed. Just a flicker, like a mask slipping. He stepped away from the lectern and walked straight to Melissa's mother. "Ruth," he said softly, using the voice he saved for public ears, "we need to handle some paperwork. Private." Ruth clutched the envelope with the hospital logo like a shield. "Not now." "It is now," Grant replied, still smiling. "The funeral home needs authorization. Otherwise, they can't proceed. You don't want delays." Melissa's sister started to rise, but the funeral director appeared at Grant's shoulder, eyes apologetic. "Ma'am, it's standard," he murmured. "Yeah, just a few signatures." They guided Ruth and the sister into a side room off the lobby. The door shut, muting the organ music into a distant hum. On the wall hung a framed photo of a lighthouse, hope staged like decoration. Grant laid 2 forms on a small table and slid over a pen. "This one releases the remains," he said, tapping the page. "This one acknowledges me as executor so I can handle costs and insurance." Ruth's hands shook. Melissa didn't. Grant leaned in, voice dropping. "If you fight me today, I will stop paying for this service. I will let the bills hit collections, and I will make sure you never see the baby's headstone inscription approved. Do you understand?" Ruth's breath caught. Grief made her slow. Money made her trapped. Melissa's sister grabbed the forms, scanning the fine print. "This isn't funeral authorization," she snapped. "This is a waiver. You're trying to make her sign away Melissa's estate." Grant's eyes hardened. "Lower your voice." "You're a liar," she whispered, tears burning. "You brought your mistress into her funeral." Grant didn't deny it. He just turned toward the door and signaled. The funeral director's assistant hovered outside, and behind him stood a security guard, broad shoulders, neutral face, ready to remove a disturbance. Grant spoke like a man ordering lunch. "If she causes a scene, escort her out. I won't have hysteria here." Melissa's sister froze. If she was removed, Ruth would be alone with him? Ruth looked from the pen to the closed door, then down at the hospital bill envelope in her lap. Her shoulders sagged. She picked up the pen. And that was Grant's real trap. Not strength, not love. Pressure, paperwork, and shame in a room where no one could hear you beg. Then Grant slid a third document onto the table, already signed in Melissa's name, and said, "Now we make the insurance pay." Grant walked back into the chapel with the pen still shaking in Ruth's hand. He guided her to the front like a prop, his palm firm on her elbow as if grief gave him ownership. The room went quiet. The maternity photo beside the casket watched it all. Melissa's hands on her belly, wedding band catching the spotlight. The gold was still warm from her skin, and it reminded Ruth of the vows Grant had once recited, hand over heart, promising forsaking all others. A nurse in the back quietly started recording. "This won't take long," Grant said, setting the forms on the lectern. Just signatures so we can close accounts and protect the baby." Melissa's sister surged forward. That's a lie. He's forcing her." "Sit down," Grant snapped, the softness gone. Then to the crowd, he added with a smile, "Pregnancy made Melissa unstable. Now her family wants drama." A wave of whispers rolled through both families. Grant's colleagues stared at the papers. The pastor's Bible lowered an inch. Diane Holloway stepped beside the microphone. "Mr. Caldwell, step away from those documents." Grant's eyes narrowed. "You have no authority here." "I have Melissa's," Diane said, and opened the red folder. "This is her last will and testament, executed 3 weeks ago, witnessed and notarized." Grant's mother rose halfway, then froze. Diane read the first clause clearly. "My husband, Grant Caldwell, and is removed as executor and receives nothing from my estate. All proceeds, including life insurance and retirement accounts, go into the Carter Family Trust for my mother, Ruth, and my son, Noah, with my unborn child named as beneficiary upon birth." Grant laughed once, sharp. "That's impossible." Diane turned another page. Second clause, if Grant Caldwell appears at my funeral accompanied by the woman he is having an affair with, he forfeits any claim to my remains, obituary, or memorial funds. Every head swung to Tessa's red coat. Tessa stood, face tightening. "This is harassment." Diane didn't look at her. Third clause, if my signature appears on any beneficiary change, claim form, or estate waiver after my death, it is a forgery. I have attached proof. She held up a printed email header. Subject, estate, urgent. Sender, Grant Caldwell. My time stamped the night Melissa died. Grant's mouth opened, but no sound came. And from the second row, Mark the paralegal stood and said, "I can confirm it, because I forwarded the full chain to her before you walked in." Mark's words hit the chapel like a dropped plate. For 1 second, nobody breathed. Then the room broke into sound. Chairs creaking, whispers spilling, someone's phone camera clicking on. Grant's coworkers stared at him like they were seeing him for the first time. A nurse near the back lifted her hand to her mouth, eyes wet with anger. The pastor stepped away from the microphone as if the air around it had turned dangerous. Grant tried to laugh again, but it came out thin. "This is absurd," he said, voice too loud. A disgruntled employee and an opportunistic attorney. "Enough," Diane Holloway cut in, holding up the printed header so everyone could see the date and time. This email was sent the night Melissa died. It discusses moving funds and fixing beneficiary changes. Tessa stood fast, chin high, but her hands shook at her sides. "You can't prove anything," she snapped, then realized how it sounded and clamped her mouth shut. Grant's mother turned on Diane, pointing like a weapon. "You're poisoning a funeral." But the crowd had already turned. Not fully toward the truth. People didn't like choosing sides, but away from Grant. Away from the red coat. Away from the smug story they'd been fed. A few of Grant's business friends actually stepped back, creating a visible gap, like reputation had a smell. Ruth felt that gap too. Eyes slid to her, assessing her grief like it was a strategy. One woman from church avoided Ruth's gaze entirely, as if sorrow was contagious. Ruth's cheeks burned. She wanted to shout that Melissa had been good, that her daughter had worked herself raw, that none of this was Ruth's doing. But her throat locked. Grant saw the hesitation and pounced. He leaned toward the funeral director. "End this," he ordered under his breath. "If she keeps reading, I'm calling the police. I'm the husband." Diane's voice stayed calm. "You can call whoever you want. The trust is filed. The notary is on record, and the cameras were preserved." At the word cameras, Grant's eyes flicked to the blinking green light above the doors. Ruth reached into her coat pocket for the ribbon with Melissa's wedding ring, something solid to hold, then froze. It wasn't there. Her fingers dug again, frantic. Empty. She looked down at the front table, at the guest book, at the chairs, then at Grant's hand, sliding something into his pocket as he turned. Ruth realized the baby documents envelope was gone, and the only copy of Melissa's hidden proof had just walked out with Grant. The chapel restroom was empty, but it still smelled like lilies and hand soap. Melissa's sister, Lauren, locked the stall door and slid down until she was sitting on the cold tile. Her hands shook so hard her phone nearly slipped. In her mind, she still saw Grant's fingers closing around Ruth's elbow, still heard him say, "Pregnancy made her unstable," as if Melissa's kindness had been a symptom. Out in the hall, the organ kept playing, soft, polite, cruel. People were already deciding what story to repeat at dinner. The widow's family caused a scene. The husband tried his best. The mistress was just a friend. Lauren pressed her forehead to her knees and tried to breathe. She hated herself for freezing. She hated the way the funeral director's staff had looked at her like she was a problem to manage. She hated that she'd let Grant steer them into that side room, that she'd watched Ruth's pen hover over paper like a surrender. And now the envelope was gone. Melissa's baby documents, the hotel receipt, the beneficiary change notice. The little pieces of truth Melissa had hidden because she'd been scared. Scared enough to plan ahead, scared enough to trust Diane, scared enough to die without ever seeing justice. Lauren's eyes burned. Tears came anyway, hot and silent, dripping onto her black skirt. She covered her mouth so nobody would hear. Then she forced her shoulders back, wiped her face with a paper towel, and stared at her own reflection in the mirror. Mascara smudged, jaw clenched. A woman who looked like she'd been punched and expected to apologize for it. "I'm done begging," she told herself. Not to Grant, not to his mother, not to anyone who mistook money for truth. She splashed water on her face, then opened her phone and typed a message to Diane. Envelope missing. He took it. She hit send before fear could talk her out of it. In the mirror, the restroom door swung open. Ruth stood there trembling, eyes hollow. "He stole her ring too," Ruth whispered. "I felt it. I saw his hand." Lauren reached for her mother's arm, steadying her. "Then we use what we have," she said, voice low. "The will. Get you Mark's email? The cameras." Ruth's lips parted, but no sound came. Only grief. Lauren's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. One text. "I saved the lobby footage. Meet me by the service exit before he leaves." Lauren found the service exit, heart-hammering, dragging Ruth with her like a lifeline. Rain slapped the back alley, cold and thin, turning the blacktop into a dark mirror. A single security light buzzed above the door. No one was there. They waited anyway, because the text had promised proof, and proof was the only thing that could stop Grant from rewriting Melissa's life into a convenient lie. A black SUV rolled past the alley mouth. Grant's car, Tessa's red coat visible through the window like a taunt. The SUV didn't slow. It disappeared around the corner, and the moment it was gone, Lauren's phone buzzed again. An unknown. "He's leaving now." "I tried." Lauren's throat tightened. "We missed it," she whispered. Ruth stared at the wet pavement as if it might open and swallow her grief. He took her ring, she said. He took her papers. And now he'll take the baby. The next hour proved her right. At the hospital, Lauren and Ruth were stopped before they reached the NICU desk. A clerk looked at the screen and frowned. I'm sorry, the father updated the visitation list. Only he is authorized right now. Lauren's hands curled into fists. He's under investigation. The clerk's voice went small. Ma'am, I don't make the rules. Ruth reached for her inhaler and found it empty. Her shoulders shook as she tried to breathe through the panic. They went straight from the hospital to the pharmacy for Ruth's heart medication. The cashier scanned the insurance card. Declined. Scanned again. Declined. Your coverage is inactive, the cashier said, glancing up with pity. Lauren felt the floor tilt. Grant had shut it off. With one phone call, he'd turned Ruth's survival into a bargaining chip. By the time they reached Melissa's house, the porch light was on, but the key didn't work. The lock had been changed. Through the front window, Lauren saw boxes stacked near the door and a man taping them shut. Melissa's family photo was face down on the floor. Lauren pounded the glass. That's my sister's home. The man inside didn't answer. He just kept packing. Ruth sank onto the porch step, rain soaking her coat, the hospital bill envelope turning to pulp in her lap. Where do we go? She asked, small as a child. Lauren had no answer until footsteps splashed behind them, and a man in a security uniform raised his hand and said, Ma'am, I saw everything, and I saved it. The security guard's name was Carl Bennett, 56, with a rain-soaked cap and a tired face that had seen too many families fall apart in polished lobbies. He kept his voice low as he led Lauren and Ruth under the awning beside the service door. I'm sorry I texted late, he said. Your sister's attorney asked this morning that we preserve the cameras. That's why I paid attention. Ruth gripped Lauren's sleeve. You saw Grant take her ring? Carl nodded once. Hallway camera, clear angle. He slipped the ribbon out of your pocket when you turned to the casket. Then he tucked it in his jacket like it was nothing. Lauren's stomach twisted. And the envelope? Same clip, Carl said. He pulled a small evidence pouch from his coat. The kind cops use, and inside was a USB drive with a handwritten label, Hartwell, 2/4/318 p.m. I copied the footage and the system log, time-stamped. I printed the access report too, who logged in, who tried to erase, and when. If he lies, the system will contradict him. And I wrote my own incident note the minute it happened. Ruth's knees buckled. Lauren caught her. Why would you risk your job? Carl looked straight at the casket room window. Because I watched that man grin at a dead woman's picture, and because my own daughter almost married someone like him. He swallowed. Somebody has to stop it. Lauren wiped rain from her cheek. He changed the hospital list. He cut off Mom's insurance. He locked us out. I know, Carl said. He called our office manager from the parking lot, told her to delete the lobby clip. She refused, but he tried. Carl tapped the pouch. That request is on the log, too. Lauren's phone buzzed. Diane Holloway. One missed call, then a text. Where are you? Lauren typed fast. Service exit. We have footage. Within seconds, Diane replied, Do not hand it to anyone. Come to my office now. Bring the guard. Carl opened the passenger door of his old sedan. I'll drive, and I'll sign an affidavit. Chain of custody matters. Ruth looked up, rain in her lashes, hope fighting its way back. Melissa planned this, she whispered. Diane's office light was already on, and a file with Grant Caldwell's name was waiting on her desk. Diane's office smelled like old paper and black coffee. Rain tapped the window as Carl set the evidence pouch on her desk, and Mark's forwarded email popped up on Diane's monitor. Diane didn't waste time. First, she said, sliding a certified copy of Melissa's will across the desk. This is filed and witnessed. Grant can scream all he wants. He is not the executor. She pointed to the next document, the Carter Family Trust. Melissa moved every major asset into this trust 3 weeks ago. House title, life insurance beneficiary, retirement. The trustee is me. The beneficiaries are Ruth, Noah, and the baby. Grant can't touch it without a judge. Ruth's hands trembled. But he changed the insurance today. That's the fraud, Diane said, clicking open Mark's email chain. Grant's message sat there with the timestamp from the night Melissa died. Instructions to update beneficiaries and get Ruth to sign the waiver. Metadata matches his work account. Mark will swear to it. His IT department can confirm it. Carl leaned forward, and the cameras show him stealing the ring and the envelope. Plus the system log shows he asked my manager to delete the clip. Diane nodded. That theft matters because it proves intent. It also means we can file an emergency petition tonight. Injunction, police report, and a fraud notice to the insurer. When they hear forgery, they freeze the payout. Lauren's voice cracked. He locked us out. He cut off Mom's meds. We'll handle that too, Diane said, gentler now. She opened a small notebook in Melissa's handwriting. Melissa left this in my safe. It lists every date he controlled her cards, every time he threatened to do it the hard way, and the name of his mistress. She also recorded a video here with a notary saying she was of sound mind and that Grant was pressuring her. If he claims she was medicated, we play it. And the envelope he stole? Copies only. The originals never left my safe. Ruth started to cry, but Diane covered her hand. You're not powerless, she said. He picked a public stage. So will we. Diane grabbed her phone and began making calls. Probate clerk, insurance fraud unit, and Grant's managing partner. And by sunrise, Diane had scheduled a hearing and ordered Grant to face the same crowd again, this time with the footage playing on a screen. That night, Lauren didn't go back to Melissa's house. Diane arranged a small furnished apartment above a church-owned thrift store, 2 rooms, clean sheets, a kettle on the counter. Ruth sat on the bed clutching Noah's backpack, as if the straps were the only thing keeping her upright. Noah had been dropped off by a neighbor after the funeral chaos. He kept asking for his mom, yet Lauren told him the truth in the only way she could. Your mom loved you, and we're going to protect what she left you. Then she gave him Melissa's photo from the chapel, the corner bent, and watched him press it to his chest. When Noah finally slept, Lauren opened Diane's file. Dates, threats, account numbers, copies of the hotel receipt. The notary video still frame of Melissa looking straight into the camera, saying Grant's full name like a warning. Lauren's hands stopped shaking. Anger was turning into something sharper. She called the dialysis clinic and explained the insurance cutoff. Diane had already faxed an emergency coverage order and a fraud notice. The nurse on the line sighed with relief and said, Bring Ruth tomorrow. We'll treat her. Lauren stared at her own reflection in the dark window. Behind, she looked like she had been surviving on adrenaline and grief. Grant counted on that. He counted on women staying quiet to keep the peace. Not anymore, Lauren said out loud. She wrote 3 boundaries on a legal pad. No private meetings. No signing anything. No letting him speak for Melissa again. Underneath, she added one more. No fear. At 2:11 a.m., Diane texted, Hearing 9 a.m. Grant will be there? Press may show. Lauren's stomach tightened, but she didn't back away. She opened Melissa's old jewelry box and found a plain silver cross and a spare ring sizer. Small, ordinary things that smelled like home. She slipped the cross on, tied her hair back, and laid out a black suit on the chair, the kind Melissa wore to job interviews. Tomorrow, Lauren would walk into the courthouse and let the truth land, line by line, in front of people who could not look away. And before dawn, she rehearsed one sentence she would say to Grant's face, while Carl cued the theft footage on his laptop. By 6:30 a.m., the rain had eased, but Lauren still felt like she was walking through water. Diane met them at the courthouse steps with a cardboard coffee tray in one hand and a thick binder in the other. Today is not about anger, she said. It's about control. Your control. Lauren stared at the binder. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple, labeled tabs in black ink. Will, trust, email, video, cameras, affidavits. Order, proof, consequences. Ruth's face looked smaller under the gray sky. Diane had already arranged Ruth's dialysis ride and emergency medication coverage, but Ruth still flinched every time her phone buzzed. Grant had trained her to expect punishment for speaking. Lauren took Ruth's hand. "He doesn't get to scare you anymore," she said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "No private meetings, no signing anything. If he talks to you, it's through Diane." Ruth swallowed. "He'll say I'm lying." "Then we show receipts," Lauren replied. "And witnesses." Inside the courthouse lobby, Grant's world was already gathering. Suits, polished shoes, familiar faces from his firm. A few people glanced at Lauren and Ruth, then looked away, as if grief had become embarrassing. Lauren felt the old shame rise in her throat, and then she remembered Melissa's maternity photo under that cold chapel spotlight, remembered Grant calling her unstable, remembered Tessa's red coat in the family row. Lauren pulled her shoulders back. "No more shrinking," she whispered. Diane leaned in. "Here's the plan," she said. "We file an emergency injunction to freeze any insurance payout and block estate interference. We submit Carl's footage and access logs, Mark's email chain, and Melissa's notary video. Then we notify the judge that Grant attempted to obtain signatures under duress at the funeral. That triggers criminal exposure if he keeps pushing." Lauren nodded once. "And what if he tries to spin it?" Diane's eyes hardened. "Then we make him spin it in front of people who can verify the facts." Mark arrived, carrying a printed packet of the email chain with headers visible and timestamps highlighted. Carl arrived next, uniform pressed, affidavit in hand. Neither man looked heroic. That made them dangerous to a liar because they looked believable. Yet Lauren opened her own folder and placed one item on top. Melissa's handwritten notebook, copied and notarized, every threat dated. "I'm done begging," Lauren said quietly. "Today we speak like we're not afraid." Diane checked the courtroom number, then nodded toward the doors. "Ready?" Lauren tightened her grip on Ruth's hand and stepped forward. And as Grant turned and saw them, the courtroom clerk called his name, while Diane raised the remote to play the funeral footage on the court screen. The judge called a brief recess, and the hallway outside the courtroom filled with low voices and hard stares. Grant tried to use the brake like a weapon. He stepped toward Ruth, shoulders squared, that same provider face he wore at church. Diane moved first, planting herself between them. "Not a word to her," she said. "Any contact goes through me." Grant's smile twitched. "You can't keep a husband from—" "You're not the executor," Diane cut in, holding up the filed trust papers like a shield. "And you're on notice for fraud." Lauren guided Ruth to a bench and knelt to fix her mother's collar, a small, everyday act that felt like restoring dignity. Then she opened Diane's binder and checked each tab again. Will, trust, email, video, cameras, affidavits, because order was the opposite of panic. Mark stood nearby with a fresh printout of the email chain, headers visible, timestamps highlighted in yellow. Carl kept the evidence pouch on his lap, sealed and signed, his affidavit already notarized. In the restroom, Lauren rinsed her face, smoothed her hair into a simple twist, and put on a clean navy blazer Diane had brought just in case. No glamour. No revenge dress. Just a woman who looked like she belonged in front of a judge. She pinned Melissa's small silver cross inside the lapel where nobody could see it but her. She whispered one sentence to her reflection, practicing the tone Diane taught her, steady, not pleading. My sister planned for this because she knew he would lie. Back in the hall, a few of Grant's colleagues avoided his eyes. One of them glanced at Tessa, who had shown up anyway, sunglasses on indoors, and then looked away like he'd finally understood what kind of man Grant was. Diane leaned close to Lauren. When the footage plays, don't look at him, she said. Look at the judge. Look at the truth. Let the room do the rest. Lauren nodded, heart loud but hands calm. She took Ruth's hand, felt the tremor, and squeezed once. Promise instead of comfort. And the clerk opened the courtroom doors again. And as they walked back in, the screen lit up with the chapel timestamp, 3:18 p.m., right before Grant's hand slid into Ruth's pocket. The courtroom screen froze on the frame everyone needed to see. Grant's hand sliding into Ruth's coat pocket at 3:18 p.m., then withdrawing the ribbon and wedding ring like he was picking a lock. The timestamp sat in the corner, indifferent and perfect. Grant's attorney stood fast. Objection. Context. Overruled, the judge said. Play the next 30 seconds. Carl's footage rolled again. Grant glanced at the chapel doors, saw the blinking camera light, and still did it. Then came the hallway clip. Grant stopping at the side room, leaning over paperwork, pressing a pen toward Ruth's shaking hand. The audio was faint, but his posture said everything. Control. Yeah, pressure. Hurry. Diane didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Your Honor, she said, we submit Carl Bennett's notarized affidavit and the system access logs showing Mr. Caldwell's request to delete footage. The judge turned to Carl. Is this footage true and unaltered? Yes, ma'am, Carl said. Copied directly from the system. Sealed in custody. Logged. Then Diane handed up Mark's email chain. Mark stepped forward, palms open, ordinary and steady. That's his email, he said. Sent the night Melissa died, he instructed me to get Ruth to sign the waiver and to update beneficiaries. I refused. I saved it. Grant's mouth worked, searching for a charm that could erase a timestamp. Nothing came. Diane clicked once more, and Melissa's notary video filled the screen. Melissa's face looked tired but clear. My name is Melissa Carter, she said, voice calm. I am of sound mind. If any documents appear after my death with my signature changing beneficiaries or naming Grant Caldwell executor, they are forged. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Less gossip now, more realization. The judge set her pen down. Mr. Caldwell, you are ordered to cease all contact with the estate, the trust, and the beneficiaries. The insurer is to freeze any payout pending fraud review. This matter is referred to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. Grant's managing partner, seated behind him, stood abruptly and whispered, We're placing you on immediate leave. For the first time, Grant looked small. Then he snapped his head toward Lauren, eyes bright with spite. Fine, he hissed, but I have one more thing. Tessa walked in late, holding a sealed envelope, and Grant said, Open it, Your Honor. This proves the baby wasn't mine. The judge took the sealed envelope from Tessa without looking impressed. She opened it, scanned the page, then lifted her eyes. This is not certified, she said. No chain of custody, no lab verification, no witness. Mr. Caldwell, do you understand what happens when you bring forged documents into my courtroom? Grant's face flashed red. It's real. Melissa, she cheated. I'm the victim here. Diane didn't even flinch. Your Honor, she said. Even if that paper were real, it's irrelevant. Melissa's trust names her unborn child as a beneficiary because she chose to. A person may leave assets to anyone. Paternity does not erase fraud. Then Diane held up one more item, an official hospital record with a raised stamp. And for the court's clarity, Melissa requested a non-invasive prenatal paternity test through her OB after she discovered the affair. The lab result is on file with the hospital, and the custodian of records is available by subpoena. Grant's attorney lowered his head like he'd just realized the client was poison. The judge's voice turned cold. Mr. Caldwell, you are now ordered to surrender any property taken from the decedent's family, including the wedding ring, and to stay away from Ruth Carter and Noah Carter. The fraud referral stands. This envelope will be logged as a potential fabrication. Grant took one step toward Diane, rage breaking through the polished act. Two bailiffs moved instantly, blocking him. In the back row, Grant's managing partner stood and said, loud enough for everyone, Grant Caldwell is terminated effective immediately. Tessa's chin lifted, but her eyes darted toward the exit. She didn't reach for Grant. She didn't defend him. She simply backed away, like a woman stepping off a sinking ship. Outside the courthouse, Diane handed Ruth a copy of the signed injunction. "Your medication is covered," she said. "Your housing is protected, and Noah's school account is funded." Ruth held the paper like it was oxygen. Lauren wrapped an arm around her and felt her mother's shoulders finally drop. A week later, Melissa's co-workers held a quiet memorial at the hospital and started a small scholarship in her name for single mothers in nursing school. Noah taped a new family photo to the apartment wall. Melissa smiling, not spotlighted, just real. Justice didn't bring Melissa back, but it put the truth where it belonged, in the light, with witnesses, with records, and with consequences.